By the second week of that particular July, Ruth Danaher's tomato field looked, to anyone driving by, like something the county should have already condemned outright. "She hasn't run water on that field in a month," Hollis Deakins said at the co-op meeting that week, shaking his head at the irrigation report spread across the table. "Vines are wilting by noon every single day. I've driven past twice this week just to make sure I wasn't imagining it." Nobody seated at that particular table disagreed with him. Ruth Danaher farmed a full 18 acres of vegetable ground 2 miles off the main county road, and by the time August rolled around, driving slowly past her tomato and melon fields had become a small, uncomfortable ritual for half the farmers in the whole district, watching leaves curl badly in the afternoon heat, watching a woman everyone in that district genuinely respected apparently ruin an entire season's crop through what looked, from the road at least, like plain stubbornness or something worse than that. She didn't explain herself once, not to a single soul on that road. She just kept quietly working, morning after morning, by a logic no one else around her could yet see or trust. Ruth was 44 years old that particular summer, lean and deeply sun, browned in the way of a woman who spent every single daylight hour outdoors entirely by her own choice rather than any real necessity. Her hands calloused and sure in the particular way of someone who trusted her own judgment more than she trusted explaining it to a room full of people who hadn't yet earned the patience to. Hear the whole reasoning through. She had inherited that same ground from her grandfather, Silas Danaher, who had farmed those exact 18 acres for 50 long years before arthritis finally forced him to stop working it entirely. And it was Silas himself, not any modern agricultural text, who had first taught her the whole careful method the entire county now watched her practice with a mixture of genuine pity and quiet, mounting alarm. Silas had dry farmed that same ground faithfully for the first 2 full decades of his long career, before the county's own groundwater district finally drilled its deep wells across the whole valley in the 1960s and made irrigation both cheap and reliable enough that every single farmer in the district, Silas himself eventually included, switched over entirely to watering their vegetable crops on a fixed weekly schedule rather than trusting the old, slow, patient method his own father had taught him decades earlier. Silas had told Ruth, more than once in her childhood, that something real had been lost in that switch, even as he made it himself, unwilling to fight the whole county's momentum alone. "A plant watered every week never has to go looking for anything," Silas told her once, standing at the edge of a field he'd farmed conventionally for 30 years by then, a young Ruth trailing behind him the way she always did on his evening walks. Roots don't reach deep for a full cup. They only reach deep because they have to. Cut the water off early, force the roots down after moisture instead of handing it to them at the surface, and the plant builds itself different. Smaller fruit most years, but the flavour concentrates in a way a spoiled plant never manages. Silas had kept his own careful journals through all 50 years of farming that ground, the early dry farmed decades and the later irrigated ones alike. And it was in the earliest of those volumes, the ones covering the years before the deep wells changed everything, that Ruth found the fullest record of a method he'd apparently loved practicing far more than he'd ever let on during the decades he spent farming conventionally instead. His entries from that early period read almost like a different man's handwriting, longer, more detailed, full of small observations about root behaviour and soil structure that his later, irrigated era journals never bothered to record at all, as though something in him had simply stopped paying that particular kind of attention once the weekly watering schedule made such careful observation unnecessary. He never said he regretted switching, Ruth told a cousin once, describing the journals. But you can feel it in how much less he wrote once he stopped needing to watch the ground that closely. Like he lost a whole language he used to speak fluently, and just quietly let it go rusty. Ruth had been 12 the first time she heard that sentence, and hadn't understood it as anything more than an old man's nostalgia for a harder way of farming. She understood it fully at 5 years before that summer, standing in her grandfather's old fields after inheriting them following his death, reading through a box of his oldest journals she found in the equipment shed. Entries from decades before she was born describing, in careful, specific detail, exactly how he'd managed the dry farming method before irrigation made it obsolete across the whole valley. Ruth's own path back to the farm had not been direct. She had left for the state university at 18, studied soil science with no particular plan to return, and spent 6 years afterward working as a laboratory technician for a regional agricultural testing company, work that paid steadily and taught her a great deal about soil chemistry, but that she had never once found as satisfying as the summers she still spent, whenever she could manage the time off, back on her grandfather's ground helping with harvest. It was Silas's decline, arthritis finally making the daily work impossible for him somewhere in his late 70s, that brought her home for good, first to help him manage the operation, and then, after his death, to inherit it outright. "I always figured you'd come back eventually," Silas told her, the year she finally did, working a row of conventional tomatoes together in the last full season his hands could manage the labour. "Didn't figure you'd bring a soil science degree with you when you did. Might actually be useful for something I never got around to trying properly." "What's that?" Ruth had asked. "Never mind," Silas said that day, and didn't explain further, and it was only after his death, finding the box of early journals, that Ruth finally understood exactly what her grandfather had been hinting at that afternoon. A whole unfinished conversation he'd apparently been saving for a moment that never quite arrived before his hands gave out entirely. She had spent 2 seasons experimenting quietly on a single acre before scaling the practice up to her full tomato and melon acreage. Her soil science background gave her a vocabulary her grandfather's generation had lacked, and she spent much of that first experimental winter reading academic literature on deficit irrigation techniques, cross-referencing the formal research against Silas's own decades-old field notes and finding, to her quiet satisfaction that the 2 sources mostly agreed, her grandfather having arrived, through pure hands-on observation, at conclusions university researchers had only later confirmed through controlled trials. What the academic papers added that Silas's journals never quite captured was the underlying mechanism, the way a plant under carefully managed water stress redirected its metabolic energy away from vegetative growth and toward the specific sugar and flavour compounds that gave dry farmed produce its distinctive concentration. A biochemical explanation for something Silas had only ever described in terms of a plant having to want it badly enough. Learning by careful trial exactly when to stop irrigation after transplanting, how deep to till before planting to encourage the kind of root penetration the method depended on, and how to read a plant's stress signals closely enough to distinguish between the healthy. Productive stress dry farming intentionally induced, and the genuine crop failure that came from simply withholding water without the deeper soil preparation the method actually required. By that 5th summer, the summer the whole county watched her fields apparently wither through the hottest stretch of the year, Ruth had built enough confidence in the method to commit her full acreage to it. Cutting irrigation entirely after an early deep watering at transplant, trusting the roots to chase moisture down through soil. She'd spent 2 years learning to prepare correctly for exactly this purpose. At the co-op, where the district's farmers gathered most weeks to review water allocations and share whatever news the season carried, Ruth's fields became, across that summer, a topic of increasingly worried conversation, the particular concern reserved for a respected neighbour who appeared to be making a serious, possibly ruinous mistake in plain view of everyone. "I stopped by her gate 2 weeks ago," Marge Talley said at one of those meetings, genuine worry in her voice rather than mockery. Asked if everything was all right, whether she needed help with anything. She just thanked me and said the crop was doing exactly what it needed to do. I didn't know what to say back to that. Hollis Deakins, who sat on the district's water allocation board and had known Ruth's grandfather for decades, offered the sharper version, carrying real institutional weight behind it that Marge's concern didn't. "It's not just her own crop she's risking," Hollis said. "The district's water allocation gets reviewed every 5 years based on actual beneficial use across all member farms. A field that looks abandoned on a summer inspection could give the state exactly the excuse it's looking for to reduce our district's total allocation, and that affects every farm on this list, not just hers." Her hired hand that summer, a quiet 19-year-old named Colton Barrow, who'd worked 2 prior seasons on a heritage hog operation before coming to Ruth's farm looking for something closer to soil work, watched the mounting worry from the co-op with a mixture of loyalty and genuine curiosity, having learned enough from his previous employer's own 30-year vindication story to recognise, at least in theory, what a stubborn, slow-proving method could eventually look like once it finally paid off. "Everybody at the co-op thinks you've lost your mind," Colton told her one morning, helping her pull test plants at the field's edge. "I keep telling them you know what you're doing. Not sure they believe me, since I'm 19 and this is only my first season watching it." "You don't have to convince them," Ruth said. "The ground will do that eventually, or it won't. Either way, arguing about it now doesn't move the timeline." "My last boss used to say something almost exactly like that," Colton said. "Took him 30 years to prove his point. I'm hoping yours goes a little faster." "So am I," Ruth admitted, "though I wouldn't bet the farm on it happening any faster than the ground decides it will." None of it changed what Ruth did each morning, which was walk her fields before the day's heat set in, checking soil moisture 6 inches down, with a probe her grandfather had used decades earlier, examining root development on plants she pulled at the field's edge for inspection, and recording, in a notebook she kept in the same careful format Silas's old journals had used, exactly how each variety was responding to the stress she was deliberately inducing. If you've ever trusted a method nobody around you could see the logic of, you know the particular quiet a person carries through a season like that. Not stubbornness, exactly. Just the plain decision to let the harvest answer the question instead of arguing with people whose worry, however genuine, was built on watching the wrong thing. The setback came in late July, and it struck at exactly the moment Ruth's confidence in the method was most vulnerable to real doubt. The Weather Service had forecast the heatwave nearly a week in advance, giving Ruth time to prepare in the only ways the dry farming method actually allowed, mulching heavily around the base of each plant to slow surface evaporation and checking every irrigation valve on the property twice to make absolutely certain none were leaking water into the soil that might undermine the controlled stress she'd spent all summer carefully managing. She had not slept well even before the heat arrived, watching the forecast numbers climb each day the week prior, understanding that whatever happened over those 4 days would test the method against conditions well outside anything her 2 seasons of smaller trials had prepared her to predict with confidence. A heat wave rolled through the valley that last week of July, temperatures climbing past 108 degrees for 4 consecutive days, well beyond the range Ruth's 2 seasons of smaller-scale experimentation had ever tested the method against. Her plants, already stressed by design, showed damage that first day of extreme heat unlike anything she'd seen in her trial years. Leaves scorching at the margins, fruit set dropping noticeably on several rows, a level of visible distress that made even Ruth, standing in the field that evening with her soil probe in hand, question for the first time all summer whether she'd pushed the method past what the ground could actually survive. Colton stayed late that first night of the heat wave, helping her walk the rows by flashlight, checking for any sign of the plants failing outright rather than simply stressing, and it was standing together in the dark, the day's heat still radiating up off ground that hadn't cooled properly even after sunset, that Ruth first let herself say out loud the doubt she'd been carrying silently all day. "I might have pushed this too far," she admitted. 2 seasons of trials never tested anything close to this kind of heat. I built the method on data that might just not cover a summer like this one. "You won't know that till you check," Colton said, echoing back, without quite realizing it, something close to what Ruth had told him herself weeks earlier. Panicking tonight doesn't tell you anything the ground can't tell you better in the morning. She called her grandfather's old friend and fellow dry farming practitioner, a retired vegetable grower named Dewey Fasland, who had farmed a similar method on a smaller scale 2 counties over decades earlier, and described the damage to him over the phone that same night, her voice carrying a strain she rarely let anyone hear. 4 days over 108 is genuinely severe, Dewey told her, careful not to minimize what she was describing. He had farmed his own smaller dry farmed acreage for over 2 decades before retiring, and he'd weathered in that time at least 2 heat events he still remembered clearly enough to describe in specific, useful detail. The particular way a genuinely dying plant's stems went soft and dull compared to a merely stressed plant's stems, which stayed firm and kept their colour even while the leaves above them scorched badly. "Check the stem before you check anything else tomorrow," Dewey told her. "Leaves lie under stress like this. Stems mostly don't. I won't pretend that's not real stress, but I want you to check something before you panic and turn the water back on. Pull 3 or 4 plants from different parts of the field tomorrow morning before the heat sets in and look at the actual root depth, not just the leaf damage. Leaves can look terrible and still be attached to roots doing exactly what you designed them to do." Ruth did not sleep well that night, standing at her kitchen window looking out at fields that had, by every visible measure the neighbours driving past could see, apparently failed. She thought about the co-op's worried faces, about Hollis Deakin's warning about the district's water allocation review, about 5 years of careful, patient work that might, in the space of a single brutal heatwave, proved to have been nothing more than an old man's romantic nostalgia applied to, literally, by a granddaughter who should have known better. "Roots don't reach deep for a full cup," her grandfather's sentence came back to her that night, sitting alone with the day's damage report still fresh in her notebook. They only reach deep because they have to. That night, staring at scorched leaves through the kitchen window, the sentence felt less like wisdom and more like a bet she had made with her whole operation's credibility. One that 108 degrees for 4 straight days might have simply proven wrong, regardless of how carefully she'd prepared the soil beforehand. She pulled the test plants at dawn the next morning, exactly as Dewey had instructed, working carefully to extract as much of the root system intact as possible, and found, brushing soil away from each plant's base, roots extending down nearly 3 feet into ground that had received no direct irrigation in over 6 weeks. A depth and density far beyond anything a conventionally irrigated tomato plant ever developed, chasing moisture that Ruth's 2 years of soil preparation had, apparently, made available exactly where the method promised it would be. Dewey's advice about the stems held true too. Once Ruth checked it that same morning, every stem on every plant she examined still firm and green beneath a canopy of scorched, curling leaves, exactly the diagnostic split Dewey had described the night before. She photographed the roots and the stems both, methodically, the same careful documentation instinct her grandfather's journals had modelled for her, building a record she suspected, even in the moment, might matter later beyond simply reassuring her own nerves that morning. The leaves told one story, the roots told a different one entirely. What would you have done, standing in a field that looked, from the road, like a season already lost, holding physical proof in your own hands that the plant's actual survival mechanism was working exactly as designed underneath all that visible damage? Ruth did not turn the water on. She trusted the root system over the leaf damage, a decision that cost her several sleepless nights over the following 2 weeks as she watched the surface stress continue without any immediate visible improvement, waiting for evidence that would not fully reveal itself until the plants moved past flowering into real fruit development weeks later. At the co-op, the mockery that had started as genuine concern sharpened, during that same stretch, into something closer to open skepticism. Ray Dunmore, driving past Ruth's fields on his way to a different appointment, stopped long enough to snap a photograph on his phone that made its way around the district's group chat within the day. Scorched leaves in stark, unflattering light, captioned with nothing more than a question mark that everyone receiving it understood exactly how to interpret. "I don't say this to be unkind," Hollis Deakins told her directly, stopping his truck at her fence line in early August. "But the board's going to need an answer soon about what's actually happening on this acreage before the Water District's inspection comes through in September." A field this far gone doesn't inspire much confidence that you're managing beneficial use responsibly, whatever your reasoning is. "I understand the concern," Ruth said. "I'm not able to explain the method in a way that'll satisfy a worried board this early in the process. I'd ask you to trust me through September, and if the crop hasn't proven itself by then, I'll take whatever consequence the board decides is fair." Colton, who'd stood a careful distance away during the fence line exchange, waited until Hollis's truck had pulled off before he said anything. "You didn't show him the root photographs," he said. "Might have settled some of that on the spot." "Photographs of roots don't mean much to a man standing in front of scorched leaves," Ruth said. "I've learned that much from watching this whole summer unfold. People believe what the ground shows them eventually, not what a picture argues on somebody else's behalf. I'd rather wait for October to do the arguing properly than convince him halfway with evidence he's not ready to trust yet." Hollis did not look satisfied by that answer and drove off without saying much further, though he did not push the issue to a formal board review that month. A small grace Ruth understood, even in her own uncertainty, as more generous than she had any real claim on. By late August, the plants had moved fully into fruit development, and it was there, finally, that the visible evidence began shifting in a direction the neighbours driving past could no longer entirely dismiss. The tomato fruit setting on Ruth's stressed vines ran noticeably smaller than a conventionally irrigated crop, exactly as her grandfather's old journals had predicted. But the fruit itself carried a deep, saturated colour and a density, testing by hand, that Ruth recognized from her 2 seasons of smaller trials as the specific physical signature of concentrated sugar and flavor compounds a water-stressed plant produced when it had genuinely survived the stress, rather than simply been damaged by it. The weeks between the heatwave and that first September harvest passed slower than any other stretch of the whole season. Ruth checking her test rows almost daily for the first real signs of fruit development, watching colour deepen gradually in a way that gave her, day by day, a growing private confidence the rest of the county had no way of sharing yet. Colton took to photographing the same handful of tomatoes every few days, an informal record of the colour shift that Ruth later found more useful than she'd expected. A visual timeline she could show skeptics that told a clearer story than any single snapshot ever could on its own. "Look at this next to the one from 2 weeks ago," Colton said one afternoon, holding both photos up side by side. "That's not subtle anymore. Even somebody who doesn't want to believe it can see that difference." She harvested her first test rows in early September, 3 weeks ahead of her main crop, and brought a crate of the fruit to the co-op meeting that same week, setting it on the table without much preamble. "I know what the fields have looked like all summer," Ruth said, addressing the room directly for the first time all season. "I'm not asking anyone to trust my explanation. I'm asking you to taste it." Marge Talley cut into the first tomato right there at the table, and the reaction that moved across her face, tasting it, was immediate and unmistakable to everyone watching. "That's not the same tomato I've been buying at the grocery store my whole life," she said. "That's not even close to the same thing." Hollis Deakins tried the next one, more skeptical, less willing to let a single tasting undo weeks of genuine institutional worry, though his own expression, chewing slowly, betrayed a surprise he clearly hadn't expected to feel. "I'll admit that's remarkable," he said. "I still need to understand the water usage numbers before the board's concerns are fully resolved. Taste doesn't answer the allocation question on its own. It will," Ruth said. "Give me the full harvest numbers before you decide anything final." Marge Talley, still holding the second half of her tomato, spoke up once more before the meeting moved on to its other business. "For what it's worth, Hollis, I don't think anybody in this room needs the water numbers to already suspect she knows exactly what she's doing. I just think we all needed the excuse to say so out loud instead of just worrying quietly in our own trucks all summer." A ripple of quiet, slightly embarrassed agreement moved through the room at that. Several of the same neighbours who'd driven past Ruth's fields shaking their heads all July, suddenly finding their coffee cups very interesting to look at, instead of meeting her eye directly. October arrived, and with it the full harvest that finally settled every question the summer's visible damage had raised. Ruth's total water usage across the full 18 acres for the entire growing season came in at less than a quarter of what a conventionally irrigated operation of the same size would have drawn from the district's shared allocation, a number that, once formally reported to the Water Board, reframed the entire concern Hollis had carried into her fence line conversation 2 months earlier. Far from risking the district's allocation through apparent neglect, Ruth's operation had used dramatically less water than any other farm on that list, precisely the kind of conservation the state's beneficial use standards actually rewarded rather than penalized, once the actual numbers replaced the summer's worried assumptions. The yield itself ran roughly 40% below what her acreage would have produced under conventional irrigation. A real and honest trade-off Ruth never tried to hide from anyone who asked. But the fruit's quality commanded a price that more than closed the gap. A regional distributor supplying a handful of high-end restaurants across the valley, having heard about the crop through the same co-op grapevine that had spent all summer worrying over it, offered Ruth a contract at nearly 4 times the standard wholesale rate for dry-farmed tomatoes and melons, a premium built entirely on the concentrated flavour her grandfather's old method had promised, and that a brutal heat wave in late July had very nearly convinced her to abandon before it had the chance to prove itself. Hollis Deckins drove out to her fields again that October, the same fence line where he'd delivered his warning 2 months earlier, and stood a long while looking at rows of small, deeply coloured fruit, still hanging on vines that had, from a distance, spent all summer looking like a crop already lost. "I owe you an apology for pushing as hard as I did in August," Hollis told her. "I was looking at leaf damage and district politics. I should have asked more questions before I let either one convince me you didn't know what you were doing on your own ground." "You weren't wrong to worry, Hollis," Ruth said. "You were looking at exactly what everybody else driving past was looking at. I didn't make it easy on anybody by not explaining sooner. That's on me as much as it's on the worry." "Why didn't you explain it all summer?" Hollis asked. "Because an explanation without the harvest behind it is just a theory," Ruth said. "My grandfather tried to explain this same method to men on this exact waterboard 40 years ago, before the deep wells went in, and got laughed out of the room because nobody had a crate of proof sitting in front of them yet. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice in one family. The restaurant contract itself came with its own small complication that first year, the distributor initially assuming Ruth could scale her acreage the following season to meet growing demand. An assumption Ruth corrected carefully in their first real negotiation. "The method doesn't scale the way conventional irrigation does," she told the distributor's buyer. "I can't just add more acres and expect the same quality, not without the 2 years of soil preparation each new section needs first. If you want this fruit long term, you're buying into a slow expansion, not a fast one." The buyer, to Ruth's quiet relief, agreed to the terms without much argument, telling her that scarcity had never once hurt a premium product's reputation among the kind of chefs willing to pay what dry-farmed produce actually commanded. The following spring, 3 other farms in the district, Ray Dunmore's among them, converted a portion of their own acreage to the same dry farming method under Ruth's informal guidance, walking their own new rows the way Ruth once walked hers, checking root depth instead of leaf appearance, trusting a process that looked, for most of a season, like exactly the kind of failure their whole farming lives had trained them to fear. "Never thought I'd be taking gardening advice from a field that looked half dead all last summer," Ray admitted at the co-op that spring, and Ruth, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself laugh outright at the memory of that photograph he'd once circulated through the district's group chat. "You can delete that photo now if you want," Ruth told him. "Or keep it. I've made my peace with it either way." "Keeping it," Ray said. "Figure I'll show it to my grandkids someday, right next to whatever this field looks like once mine's finally caught up to yours." Colton stayed on with Ruth through that transition spring, formally hired now rather than simply helping out. And it was Ray's own teenage daughter, curious after hearing her father talk about the method all winter, who started coming by on weekends to learn the soil probe work directly from Ruth herself, the same quiet, patient instruction Ruth had once received from her grandfather on evening walks decades earlier, passed forward now to a new generation that hadn't yet had the chance to doubt it. The state's water district, reviewing the county's full allocation report that same winter as part of its regular 5-year cycle, cited Ruth's operation specifically, alongside 2 other dry farming pioneers in neighbouring counties, as a model of the exact kind of beneficial use conservation the review process had been designed to encourage rather than punish. a formal recognition that reached Hollis Deakins' own board packet months before it ever reached Ruth directly, and that Hollis, to his credit, forwarded to her personally the same week he received it, rather than letting her hear about it second-hand through the usual co-op grapevine. "Thought you'd want to see this before the board meeting makes it official," Hollis wrote in the note attached. "Seemed like the least I could do, given everything." Ruth was 49 that fall. 5 years past the season the whole county watched her fields wither through the hottest stretch of the year, and she still walked her rows most mornings before the heat, soil probe in hand, out of habit, more than need now, checking root depth the same unhurried way her grandfather had taught her on evening walks 4 decades earlier. Dewey Fasland came to that first field day too, driving over from his own retired acreage 2 counties away, and stood near the back of the small crowd, listening to Ruth explain the method she'd once described to him, panicked, over the phone during 4 days of unbearable heat. He caught her eye once during the talk and gave her a small, satisfied nod, the particular nod of a man who had spent decades practicing something he suspected might quietly die with him, watching it instead find its way into a whole new generation of hands. She had started, that same fall, hosting a small annual field day for other growers curious about the method, standing at the edge of the same tomato field that had once drawn a worried photograph and an anonymous question mark through the district's phones, explaining exactly what her grandfather had once tried and failed to explain to a room unwilling, 40 years earlier, to wait for the proof. "Roots don't reach deep for a full cup," she told that first field day crowd, standing in a row of small, deeply coloured fruit that had finally, after 5 long years, stopped needing anyone's patience to justify itself. "They only reach deep because they have to." The thought carried none of the doubt it had carried the night of the heat wave. Sitting alone at her kitchen window, certain she'd bet her whole operation's credibility on an old man's nostalgia. It felt, finally, like the plain agricultural truth her grandfather had spent 50 years believing, vindicated not by luck, but by 2 years of careful preparation, and 1 brutal, nearly unbearable season of trusting roots over leaves. Ruth thought sometimes, standing at that field's edge on a quiet October morning, about the particular loneliness of that first heatwave night, standing in the dark with Colton, and a doubt she'd never fully admitted out loud to anyone else that summer. She understood now, 5 years further along, that the doubt itself had never really been the danger. The danger had only ever been the possibility of acting on it too soon, turning the water on before the roots had finished proving what they were capable of on their own, undoing in a single panicked evening what 2 years of careful soil preparation had spent building. She kept her grandfather's early journals on a shelf in the farmhouse office, alongside her own 5 volumes now. Matched in format, a language she suspected Silas would have been glad to see spoken fluently again on that same ground, decades after he'd let it go quiet, without ever quite explaining why to anyone who might have carried it forward sooner. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth keeping from it. 5 long, patient years, and 1 nearly unbearable heatwave later. The county hadn't doubted Ruth because they were cruel. They doubted her because a wilting field in July looks, to anyone driving past without the full picture, like exactly what it appears to be: neglect, mistake, a crop already lost. But some of the most important work happening on a piece of ground is invisible from the road entirely, quietly unfolding 3 feet down in soil nobody driving past ever thinks to actually dig into, and sometimes the only way the whole picture finally comes into full, undeniable view is waiting, patiently and quietly, for the 1 single month of the year that was always going to prove the entire point. She thought, too, about the specific weight of never once explaining herself all summer, a choice that had cost her some real goodwill in the district, even as it had, in the end, protected the method's credibility from being reduced to an argument nobody was yet equipped to evaluate fairly. She did not think that silence was the only way to have handled it. She understood, 5 years on, that a younger version of herself, less certain of the ground beneath the theory, might have needed to explain constantly, defensively, in a way that would have made the eventual proof feel smaller than it deserved to feel once it finally arrived. Patience, she'd learned, was not the same thing as secrecy, even though from the road, that whole first summer, the two had probably looked identical to anyone driving past. Ray's daughter finished her first full season shadowing Ruth's soil probe work that same fall, keeping her own small notebook now in a format she'd copied, without quite realising it, from the same careful structure Silas Danaher had first used decades earlier, a structure that had travelled, by then, from a grandfather to a granddaughter to a neighbour's daughter who'd never once met the man whose handwriting had started the whole quiet tradition. If you've ever trusted a process nobody around you could see the logic of, tell us where you're listening from and about the person, gone now perhaps, who first taught you to trust the roots you couldn't see over the leaves everybody else insisted on judging you by. If this story found you today, share it with somebody who is still, right now, quietly waiting on their own personal October to finally arrive and speak for itself. Whatever bone-dry stretch you're standing in tonight, whatever season of visible, uncomfortable doubt you're patiently working your way through while everyone around you shakes their head, may your own roots be reaching exactly where they need to underneath all of it. And may the harvest, when it finally, undeniably comes, reframe every worried look you were ever given along the way.